Welcome back to Scouching's 2024 Prospect Pipeline series, where we take a look at every NHL team's overview of their prospects in the system, group them into general tiers, and just have a little chat about where they stand as an organization. Today we're looking at the Chicago Blackhawks, and they are early in this video series not only because they've drafted very often, but in my opinion they've drafted a lot of really interesting players. But before we get into it, I want to describe what exactly a prospect is in my database and what these tiers mean. So, a prospect to me is players within 5 years of their first year of draft eligibility, as well as not having played more than a full season on an NHL roster to this point. In terms of the tiers, we start at franchise, which are players that you never ever trade and you keep on your roster as long as you possibly can. We've got core under that, who are really important players to a roster that you don't trade unless you absolutely have to. We've got the depth category, which is your second, third, fourth line, everyday NHL players who do the thing and do it pretty well. We've got a maybe category for guys that are a little bit more on the outside, which may have lower upside that might not be enough for an NHL team, or a lot of upside and risk of not hitting it, and they're just overall maybes. And at the bottom, we have everybody else, where I feel like they're probably a bit of a long shot to play in the NHL in some capacity, but it doesn't mean that it's impossible. So to start things off in the core category, we have three names, and Artyom Levshinov, Frank Nazar, and Oliver Moore. Now, I will say Connor Bedard was a franchise player last year, but having played on the roster for a full season, he has been removed from the database. So let's start with Frank Nazar, a first-round pick from a couple of seasons ago who made his debut this year. He upgrades himself from a depth projection for me to a core projection, and I think he's just taken step after step after step and become a really brilliant 200-foot player that should be an important NHL player sooner rather than later. Oliver Moore is a player I love. He was a top 5 player for me last year. I thought he was a massive steal where Chicago got him. I could tell from Kyle Davidson's body language that he feels the same way as well when they drafted him. I do think that he should take a big step forward offensively this year because he has so much to bring in that area, and the production just wasn't quite there last year, but when you watch the Minnesota team last year he was on, he looked pretty darn good. So we'll see where things go with him, but I'm really excited about Oliver Moore. And rounding things out, we've got second overall pick from this year, Artyom Levshinov. Now, I will say he was lower on my board than 2. Would I have drafted him at 2? No. But he's on the Blackhawks and there's nothing we can do about it, and I do think he's going to be a solid NHL player. I'm not sure how much offense he'll bring to the table in the NHL, but I do think as a defensive player with the way he plays the game, he should develop into a pretty solid player. I'm not sure I would assign him to an ELC right away, but we'll see what happens. Being in Rockford probably is going to be a good fit considering how young that team should be and a lot of these young players they've drafted now entering the pro ranks, so I think it'll be an interesting environment for him to grow up in. Moving into the depth category, we have a few names here. We've got the guys they drafted in the first round this year and a couple of years ago in Sacha Boisvert, Marek Vanacker, and Sam Rinzel, all of whom I'm pretty big fans of, and I think that especially with a guy like Boisvert, there's a ton of upside there to work with. Vanacker is a player who I was a little lower on than when they picked him, but I feel like he could be a player down the lineup in Chicago one day. Sam Rinzel has slowly but surely been developing, and he always was going to be a player that took a little bit more time to come along as he probably could, and I think you keep giving him some time to develop, and I think you'll be greatly rewarded for doing so. In net, they've got Drew Comezzo, who had a pretty solid season with Rockford last year, and I think there is a possibility he's a down-the-lineup goaltender for the Chicago Blackhawks one day, but nothing is a sure thing with goaltenders, but he's an interesting one. Moving down to the maybes category, there's quite a few here. Guys with high upside and maybe a bit of a lower floor, and guys like John Mustard, AJ Spellacy. I like Landon Slaggert for similar reasons to those previous two. Guys like Nolan Allen I think are a bit of a maybe, but they could be a bottom 6 NHL player. Paul Ludwinski is a player I could maybe see in an NHL role one day as well. I'm a really big fan of Martin Misiak, but even I will admit that there's a bit of a downside to his game, but I do really like what he brings to the table, and as a bottom 6 forward of some kind, I could see a possibility there. Nick Lardis is a player with a lot of upside as well, so again, you kind of get a feel for what this is. Guys that maybe have NHL upside and guys who maybe could be really good in the NHL, but you can't quite project them in that way yet. Next we have everyone else, and if you'll notice here, Chicago has a lot of players in the everyone else category, and I mean, they've just drafted a lot over the years, and not everyone can come along as expected. I think there are some players here who maybe push the potential of this tier, guys like Gavin Hayes or Colton Dock, maybe a guy like Ryder Rolston could maybe get himself out of the basement here. I'm curious about Joel Svensson as well, but these just aren't guys that I've been like super crazy about over the last few years. And the focus on these videos is always on the players at the top end of the pyramid, and again, making the NHL is really, really hard. So for me, these guys all just are somewhat of a long shot, and we'll see where they go from here. So that's it for the Chicago Blackhawks. If you liked it, you can click like and subscribe. If you really liked it, check out Scouching.ca, where a subscription will get you early access to content, exclusive written content, a Discord server, as well as exclusive data tables you won't find anywhere else, and tons of other fun stuff, so you can check that out at Scouching.ca. So with that, we close out the Chicago Blackhawks, and next we're going to be looking at the Nashville Predators.